My name is Evelyn Vance, 72 years old, 41 years making sure the numbers told the truth. After Franklin died, I raised my son Julian and daughter Chloe alone. I gave them everything: my home, my accounts, my trust. I found a $50,000 withdrawal I never authorized. At dinner, I put the statement in front of Julian. The numbers don't add up. Probably just an administrative error. I'll make some calls. I've already made calls, I said. He looked past me. 3 weeks later, I had a stroke. While I lay on the floor unable to speak, Julian pressed my limp finger to my phone and deleted the evidence. 4 minutes and 31 seconds before he called 911. In the hospital, he spoke loud enough for the nurses to hear. She's been senile for years. She's a danger to her own finances. I was conscious. I heard every word. My penthouse was listed for sale. They were drinking my 1945 Bordeaux when Marcus, following my instructions, remotely accessed the smart home system from his home in Oak Park. The pantry wall slid open with a mechanical hiss. A screen dropped from the ceiling. The footage began to play Julian crouching beside me on the kitchen floor, pressing my limp finger to my phone. Before he called 911, the glass slipped from his hand. The 1945 Bordeaux spread across the marble. Mom, let me explain. Julian, I said, don't. Before we go any further, please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. Behind that wall, a server rack had been running for 8 years. He forgot what I did for a living. The 401k statement arrived on a Tuesday. Evelyn Vance had always believed that numbers told the truth when people wouldn't. For 41 years, she had been the woman the partners called when the books didn't balance. The one who could find a misfiled decimal in a column of 1,000 entries without breaking a sweat. She had audited the accounts of Chicago's most powerful men who wore custom suits and spoke in the polished cadences of old money, and she had never once been fooled by a well-constructed lie. Numbers, she always said, left fingerprints. So when she opened the envelope that Tuesday morning, sitting at the small writing desk near the floor-to-ceiling windows of her 53rd floor penthouse, and saw the figure printed in a clean, unfeeling font, her body went still in the particular way of someone who already knows the answer to a question they haven't yet allowed themselves to ask. $50,000. Withdrawn. Authorization pending review. Outside the glass, Lake Michigan stretched to the horizon, gray and vast under a November sky. The city moved 30 stories below in its usual indifferent rhythm, the yellow flash of taxis, the white pulse of pedestrian crossings, the faint geometry of the elevated train curling through the South Loop. Evelyn had lived in this penthouse for 19 years. She knew the view the way she knew her own reflection, every angle, every shift of light depending on the season. But that morning, looking out at it, she felt as though the glass between her and the city had thickened overnight into something she could no longer see through clearly. She set the statement down on the desk. Then she picked it up again. $50,000. The account in question was her retirement fund, the one she had been contributing to since 1983. The one she had rebuilt from near zero after her husband Franklin's death in 1998. The one she had never once touched in the 26 years since, because she had always believed that a woman's financial independence was the last wall standing between dignity and dependence. She had not authorized this withdrawal. She had not spoken to the fund manager in 8 months. She had not signed anything. She reached for her reading glasses, though she didn't need them for a number that large. The withdrawal date was October 14th. 3 weeks ago, almost to the day. Evelyn pressed her fingertips flat against the surface of the desk cool marble, black and white veined, a piece she had selected herself from a showroom in Milan, and she breathed slowly. She was 72 years old, and she had survived the kind of losses that left other women shattered, a husband gone too soon. A career she'd fought for in rooms where she was the only woman present. A loneliness that had sharpened over the years into something almost comfortable in its predictability. She was not a woman who panicked. She was a woman who gathered evidence. She picked up her phone and called Julian. He arrived at 7, as she knew he would. Julian had never been able to refuse a dinner invitation from his mother, not because of sentiment she had come to understand, but because he needed to keep her close enough to monitor. She had set the table with the good china, lit the pillar candles she kept on the sideboard, opened a bottle of the 2019 Sancerre she preferred in autumn. The penthouse looked the way it always did in the evenings, composed, elegant, the city lights beginning to come alive below, like a second skyline reflected beneath the first. Julian was 45 years old and had the kind of face that was still handsome in a way that no longer entirely served him. He had inherited his father's jaw and his mother's eyes pale gray, perceptive though. Where Evelyn's eyes had always been trained on what was actually in front of her, Julian's had developed, over the years, a quality of looking just past things, as though the real event were always happening slightly to the left of wherever his attention appeared to be directed. She had noticed this years ago, and had told herself it was ambition. Later, she had told herself it was stress. She was revising that interpretation now. He kissed her cheek at the door. He smelled of aftershave and something else, something she couldn't name, but recognized the way you recognize weather changing, a faint undercurrent of anxiety underneath the surface calm. "You look well," he said. "Sit down," she said. She had placed the 401k statement face down on the table beside his place setting. She let him settle, let him pour himself a glass of the Sancerre without being asked. Let him begin the performance of ease that she had been watching him rehearse for the better part of a year. He spoke about a case vaguely, in the elliptical way he had adopted when he no longer wanted her to ask. Follow-up questions, and she listened and responded, and watched him with the same still attention she had once given to balance sheets. His eyes moved once to the Ring camera hub mounted on the wall near the kitchen entrance. Just a flicker. A professional might not have noticed it. Evelyn noticed everything. She waited until he had finished the first course. Then she turned the statement over. She placed her hand flat on the cold marble counter as she rose from her chair, a gesture she had not planned, but which felt necessary, as though the surface could ground her in something solid while the rest of the room tilted slightly on its axis. She carried the paper to him and set it down in front of his plate. "Julian," she said. Her voice was level. She had practiced this without knowing she was practicing it. "The numbers don't add up." He looked at the statement. Something moved behind his face, a sequence she watched the way. She had once watched columns of figures, tracking each shift for what it revealed rather than what it concealed. First recognition, then calculation, then the decision to perform confusion. "What is this?" he said. "You know what it is." "Mom, I haven't touched your accounts." "I didn't say you had. I said the numbers don't add up." She returned to her seat. Her voice had not trembled again. She would not let it. $50,000 were withdrawn from my retirement account on October 14th. I did not authorize the withdrawal. I did not speak to the fund manager. I signed nothing. Julian set down his fork. His hand, she noticed, was very still on the table. The stillness of someone who had learned, at some point, that the body's instinct to move was a liability. "There's probably an administrative error," he said. "These things happen. I'll make some calls tomorrow." "I've already made calls," she said. A silence moved between them. Outside, the city continued its indifferent business 40 stories below. Evelyn looked at her son at the face she had memorized in the first seconds of his life, in the particular, helpless way that parents memorize their children before they know what kind of people those children will become. And she felt something she could not immediately name. Not grief exactly, not quite anger. Something colder than both. The sensation of a room where you had expected warmth and found instead a draft you could not locate the source of. She thought of the marble counter beneath her hand, the cold precision of it. She thought of every column she had ever balanced, every discrepancy she had ever traced to its origin. "I want to understand what happened," she said carefully. "Help me understand." Julian picked up his wine glass. He didn't drink from it. He held it the way people hold objects when they need something to do with their hands. "I told you," he said. "Administrative error." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, slowly, the way she had always nodded when she was done with a conversation that had told her everything she needed to know. "Of course," she said. She refilled her own glass. She asked him about his drive over from Lincoln Park. She listened to his answer. And beneath the ordinary surface of the dinner, in the place where she did her real work, the place that had always been quieter and more precise than anything she showed the world, she began, without haste and without sentiment, to build a case. The city lights blurred slightly outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. She gripped the edge of the wine glass with two fingers, not tightly, just enough to feel the crystal. She had not gotten here by being fooled twice. The power of attorney form arrived on a Friday, slipped inside a manila envelope that Julian presented with the practiced casualness of someone who had rehearsed the gesture in front of a mirror. It was mid-November now, and the penthouse had taken on the particular quality of light that came with the season flatter. More diffuse, the lake outside the windows gone to a pewter shade that absorbed the sky rather than reflecting it. Evelyn had spent the 2 weeks since the dinner doing what she had always done when a set of books didn't reconcile. She went back to the beginning and looked at everything again, more slowly. She had found 3 additional discrepancies. 2 smaller withdrawals from a secondary brokerage account, $8,000 in September, $12,000 in August, and a notation in her online banking that showed a third-party login from an IP address she didn't recognize. Time-stamped at 2:47 in the morning on a Saturday in July. She had written the figures in her narrow, precise hand in a leather notebook she kept in the inside pocket of her cardigan, and she had said nothing to Julian about any of it. She was learning to let him think she didn't know what she knew. He came on a Friday afternoon, unannounced except for a text message sent 90 minutes before his arrival, which was itself a kind of announcement. Julian had always believed that insufficient notice was a form of control, a way of catching people before they could compose themselves. It hadn't worked on Evelyn when he was 15, and it didn't work now, but she appreciated the consistency. He sat in the chair across from her writing desk, the one upholstered in pale gray linen, and he crossed one leg over the other and spoke in the smooth, confident register he had developed as a defense attorney, a voice engineered to make complicated things sound simple and simple, things sound reasonable. He said he had been speaking to a financial consultant. He said there were certain tax optimization strategies available to individuals of her asset profile. He said the term with the ease of someone who had used it before, who had perhaps practiced the particular way. It could make 72-year-old women feel as though declining to understand it would be a kind of failure. Then he slid the reverse mortgage application across the desk. Evelyn looked at it without touching it. She had seen reverse mortgage instruments before in her professional life. She understood their mechanics and their implications in the particular thorough way she understood most financial instruments, which was to say she understood not only how they worked, but who benefited from them and under what circumstances they became. As she had once described to a junior colleague, a very elegant way of watching someone sign their house away while believing they were doing something clever. And this, she said, her voice unhurried, is the tax optimization. Julian spread his hands in a gesture of benevolent explanation. It's a liquidity tool. You're sitting on significant equity in the penthouse. This frees up capital without requiring me to sell, she said. Exactly. While the bank holds the title as collateral, a small pause. It's more nuanced than, Julian. She looked at him directly. I spent 41 years explaining financial instruments to people who didn't want to understand them. You don't need to simplify this for me. He recrossed his legs. His jaw shifted in the subtle way it had always shifted when he was recalibrating. Mom, I'm trying to help you protect what you've built. It was at this point that he produced the second document. He took it from the same manila envelope with a gesture that was perhaps intended to seem incidental. Here is one thing, and here, almost as an afterthought, is another, and laid it beside the mortgage application. A power of attorney form. Standard boilerplate, her name already typed in the designated fields. The signature lines were blank. There was a notary stamp at the bottom dated 2 weeks in the future. She looked at the form. She looked at his hand beside it, which was shaking slightly, a detail he could not seem to control, which told her more than anything he had said. She thought of Franklin, her late husband, who had possessed a particular talent for recognizing the moment when a negotiation had already been decided, when the other party was simply waiting for you to catch up to the conclusion they had already reached. The kitchen is where we feed the family, he used to say, but the pantry is where we protect them. She had thought of that phrase often over the past 2 weeks. I'll have my attorney review this, she said. There's no need. There is always need, she said, to have an attorney review a document that transfers legal authority over your financial affairs. That is, in fact, precisely what attorneys are for. Julian stood. The composed surface of him had developed a hairline fracture, nothing visible to anyone who hadn't been studying him for 45 years. But to Evelyn, it was as legible as a figure circled in red. She walked him to the door. She said goodnight in the ordinary way. She watched the elevator doors close behind him. Then she went back to her writing desk, opened the leather notebook, and wrote 2 more entries beneath the others. She called her attorney that evening. He was unavailable. She left a message. She called again Saturday morning. He was in depositions. On Sunday, she woke at 5:30, the way she had woken every morning for the past 40 years. And she lay in the dark penthouse and listened to the quiet and thought about the IP address logged at 2:47 in the morning in July. She thought about the Ring camera hub and the way Julian's eyes had moved to it during the dinner. She thought about the power of attorney form with her name already typed in the blank fields. She got up and made coffee and stood at the window and watched the lake come visible as the sky lightened, gray to pale silver to a thin wintry white. She was still standing there, the coffee cooling in her hand, when the headache began. It came on the way she imagined storms came to sailors at sea, first a change in pressure, a quality of wrongness in the air, before the specific thing announced itself, and then the thing itself, a searing, concentrated pain that moved from the base of her skull forward and to the left, sudden and total. Unlike anything she had experienced in her life, she had time to think, very clearly, this is serious. She had time to reach for the phone on the desk beside her. She did not have time to dial. She became aware of Julian's presence before she could fully account for where she was. She was on the floor, the cool marble of the kitchen. She understood from the temperature against her cheek, and her body wasn't responding to the instructions. She was sending it with any of its usual precision. Her right hand could move. Her left side felt distant, muffled, as though packed in cotton batting. The searing pain had not diminished so much as spread, flattening into a roaring pressure that made it difficult to isolate individual thoughts. But she could see. And what she saw was Julian, standing in the kitchen doorway, looking down at her. He had a key to the penthouse. She had given it to him years ago when she'd had her hip replaced because she had no one else she trusted to water her orchids. She was revising that decision now, with the particular clarity that crisis imposed on long overdue reckonings. He was on his phone. He was not dialing 911. She could tell this because she could see his face. And the face of a person calling for emergency services had a specific quality of urgency that was entirely absent from his expression. He was looking at her with something that was not horror and was not concern. It was a quality of attention that she would later, with more time to consider it, classify as calculation. He was watching her the way she had watched balance sheets. He was taking inventory. He crossed the kitchen. He crouched beside her. He picked up her right hand not to hold it, not to check her pulse, but with a directional, purposeful movement, and she understood what he was doing. A half second before he did it, he pressed her limp finger against the home button of her smartphone, which lay on the floor 2 feet away, and the screen unlocked with its familiar chime. She could not speak. She could not move with any coordination. She watched him navigate to her email application with the focused efficiency of someone working against a time constraint and begin deleting the alerts from the retirement fund. The automated notifications she had set up 3 years ago. The ones that had flagged the unauthorized withdrawal. He deleted them with his thumb, one by one, in the quick, practiced way of someone who had thought about doing this before. The shadows of the penthouse stretched across the marble floor in the early morning light. She reached for the phone. Her arm moved perhaps 6 inches before it stopped responding. He picked up the phone and stood. He looked down at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read. Not unkindness, exactly, which somehow made it worse, but something more like absence. The face of a person for whom the person on the floor had already become a problem to be managed rather than a mother. He dialed 911. She heard him tell the dispatcher that he had arrived to find his elderly mother collapsed. His voice was steady and appropriately worried. He gave the address. He said he didn't know how long she had been on the floor. She listened to his voice and felt a single cold, clarifying thought move through the pain like a thread pulled taut. He waited. The sirens were distant at first, then closer. She closed her eyes against the light. She held on to the single thread of that thought and did not let it go. The ICU at Northwestern Memorial had a particular quality of stillness that was unlike any other silence Evelyn had encountered. Not peaceful, but suspended, a held breath kind of quiet, broken at intervals by the soft percussion of monitoring equipment and the muffled transit of shoes on linoleum. She had been conscious in the partial, uncertain way of someone moving in and out of a heavy fog for approximately 2 days before she became consistently aware of her surroundings. The stroke had affected her left side and her speech. Her arm moved now with the reluctant imprecision of a poorly calibrated instrument. Her words, when she attempted them, snagged somewhere between intention and execution. She knew what she wanted to say, could feel the architecture of sentences intact within her. But the path from thought to sound had been damaged in the way of a road after a flood, passable in theory but unreliable in practice. She had learned this in stages, each discovery adding itself to the previous ones, with the quiet accumulation of a column of figures. She could understand everything said to her. She could not reliably make herself understood. She could track faces, read expressions, follow conversations conducted on the opposite side of a partially open door. This last ability would prove to be the most important. The meeting with the social worker happened on a Wednesday, 2 weeks after her admission. Evelyn knew it was happening because she had heard the nurses discuss it the previous evening in the corridor outside her room. Not the specifics, but the date and the names, which was enough. She had spent the intervening hours in the particular way she had spent waiting periods throughout her career. Not passively, not with resignation, but with the concentrated attention of someone building a mental record that might later need to be reconstructed from memory alone. The social worker's name was Deborah. She was a careful woman, clearly experienced, and she had the manner of someone who had spent years in institutional settings learning to manage the gap between what families said and what was actually happening to the people in their care. She met with Julian and Chloe in the small administrative office adjacent to the nursing station, a room with a glass partition and a door that did not close entirely, flush with its frame. Evelyn's bed was positioned 12 feet from that door. She could hear the ventilation system. She could hear the monitoring equipment. And she could hear, with intermittent clarity depending on the angle of the door, and the volume of whoever was speaking, what was being said in the administrative office. Julian spoke first. He spoke at a volume calibrated to carry not shouting, but elevated with the particular projection of a man who had spent 2 decades in courtrooms and understood the acoustics of institutional spaces. Whether this was deliberate, she could not determine. She suspected it was. "She's been suffering from advanced dementia," he said, "for years. This stroke is really it's an escalation of something that's been progressing for a long time." Evelyn lay still. Her right hand found the bed rail and wrapped around it slowly. "The memory issues," Chloe added, her voice lighter, more practiced in a different register. The register of a person performing concern rather than experiencing it. She'd get confused about what day it was, where she'd put things. Her finances have been in disarray for. She's a danger to her own finances, Julian said. He raised his voice slightly on the last phrase, the way lawyers did when they wanted something to land in the room beyond the room they were in, ensuring Evelyn understood that the nurses at the station could hear. She squeezed the bed rail. The metal bit into her palm. Deborah asked measured questions in the careful way of someone gathering documentation, not credulous, not skeptical, simply methodical. She asked about prior diagnosis, about symptoms, about the timeline of Julian's concerns. She asked whether Evelyn had a designated healthcare proxy. Julian produced a document. Evelyn could not see it, but she could hear the sound of paper placed on a desk, the particular sound of something official being presented with confidence. She thought of the power of attorney form, with her name already typed in the blank fields. She thought of her attorney who had never returned her second call. She thought of 41 years of balanced books and what it meant that Julian had been practicing this narrative long enough to deliver it without hesitation. It was during the second half of the meeting, Deborah asking about long-term care options, Julian responding with the name of a facility in a tone that suggested he had already investigated it thoroughly, that Evelyn became aware of Chloe. Her daughter had positioned herself near the window of the administrative office, angled away from the social worker's direct line of sight, and she was looking at her phone with the focused absorption of someone engaged in a task she found genuinely interesting. Evelyn watched her through the partially open door, the tilt of her head, the quick movement of her thumbs, the small, satisfied expression that crossed her face when something appeared to go well. Chloe was 38 years old and had spent the better part of her 30s constructing and reconstructing an influencer persona around luxury goods and aspirational lifestyle content, an enterprise that had never quite achieved the traction she believed it deserved and had left her, as far as Evelyn had been able to determine from oblique comments in the occasional overheard phone call, carrying the kind of high-interest credit card debt that accumulated when a person bought the appearance of a life they couldn't sustain. On Chloe's phone screen, visible in the gap of the doorway, was a resale application. The photograph in the listing showed a Birkin bag orange with gold hardware, a limited edition Evelyn had purchased in Paris 11 years ago at a boutique on Rue de Faubourg. Saint-Honoré, the bag she kept in the dedicated climate-controlled section of her wardrobe. The bag she had told both her children, on more than one occasion, was not an investment, not an asset, and not theirs. Chloe's thumbs moved. The listing appeared to post. The fluorescent lights above Evelyn's bed hummed. She recognized with a detached precision of someone who had learned to inventory rather than react in the moments, when reaction would cost her, that she was a ghost in her own tragedy. She was present, conscious, tracking every word and action with the same acuity she had brought to 40 years of professional work. And she was entirely invisible, her intelligence, her judgment, her voice, her ownership of every object in that wardrobe erased by a performance. Her son was delivering in an adjacent room to a social worker who had no reason to disbelieve him. She looked at the fluorescent lights. She looked at the ceiling tiles, water-stained at one corner, institutional beige. She looked at her right hand on the bed rail. The metal was cold and solid. It didn't give under pressure. She held on to it and she thought very clearly and without sentiment about the encrypted USB key she had placed 7 years ago inside the pill organizer on the top shelf of her medicine cabinet, the one she had stopped using when she switched to a different brand, the one that Julian, if he was cataloging her possessions, would classify as trash. She breathed slowly. She was 72 years old and she had built things that lasted, and she was not done. The meeting in the administrative office concluded. She heard chairs moving, the social worker's careful professional farewell, the sound of the door opening wider. Julian emerged first, smoothing his jacket, his face reconfigured into the expression of a son managing a difficult situation with admirable composure. He paused in the doorway of her room. He looked at her. She looked back. She did not look away. She did not show him what she was thinking. She had learned this too from the books, that the most important information was always the information you did not volunteer. After a moment, he nodded once, gave her the small, gentle smile of a son reassuring an uncomprehending parent, and left. Evelyn released the bed rail. She looked at the indentation it had left across her palm. She pressed it slowly with her thumb, feeling the shape of it. I am still here, she thought. And you have made a very... The nursing home Julian selected was called Lakeview Gardens, a name that bore no relationship to either lakes or gardens. It occupied the third and fourth floors of a converted office building in a neighborhood where the streetlights went out at intervals and stayed out, where the nearest park was a concrete rectangle with a broken bench and a single tree that had survived on institutional indifference. The room they put Evelyn in was on the third floor, east-facing, which meant it received a narrow shaft of morning light for approximately 90 minutes before the adjacent building cut it off entirely. The walls were painted a beige that had once been white. The floor was linoleum in a pattern that had been fashionable in 1987 and had not aged well. There was a plastic chair, a pressboard wardrobe, a bed with a thin mattress, and a small bedside table with a drawer that stuck. The smell was a compound of institutional cleaning solution and the particular staleness of spaces where windows were rarely opened, not unclean exactly, but accumulated, the residue of too many lives processed through a room that had never been designed to hold them. Evelyn had lived in a penthouse for 19 years. She had traveled to 31 countries. She had eaten at three-star restaurants in Lyon and had the ability, which she had cultivated as a professional asset, to assess the quality of any environment within approximately 45 seconds of entering it. She gave Lakeview Gardens 30 seconds. She found the Medicare denial notice on her fourth day there, in the small drawer of the bedside table, slipped behind a Gideon Bible and a photocopied activities schedule. It had been opened and refolded, which meant someone had read it before placing it there, not delivered to her directly, not explained. Just positioned in the drawer the way you might place something in a location where it could theoretically be argued it had been accessible. The notice informed her, in the careful bureaucratic language of government documents, that her coverage for the private care facility she had been using prior to the stroke had been discontinued. The reason cited was a change in the designated account holder for her supplemental insurance premium payments. The account from which those payments had been drawn had been closed. She held the paper in her right hand and read it twice. Her reading speed had always been precise. She had cultivated it as a professional asset. The ability to absorb a document thoroughly and quickly, to extract the operative information from the surrounding administrative language. The ability had survived the stroke intact. Julian had stopped paying for her private care, not redirected it, stopped it. She refolded the notice. She placed it back in the drawer. She removed it again and put it under the thin mattress instead, in the particular way of someone who had learned, in the past several weeks, not to leave anything they needed in a location that someone else could access without her knowledge. A week after her arrival, she found out about the penthouse. One of the nursing aides, a young woman named Carmen, who had the compressed efficiency of someone working 2 jobs and still couldn't make the math work, and who was one of the 3 people in the facility, who spoke to Evelyn as though she were fully present, had mentioned it without understanding the significance of what she was mentioning. Carmen had a cousin in real estate, and the cousin had texted her a listing. The listing was Evelyn's penthouse. Carmen showed her the phone with the guileless helpfulness of someone sharing interesting news, and Evelyn looked at the photographs of her own home, arranged on a real estate website like the inventory of an estate sale. The kitchen with its black and white marble, the living room with the floor-to-ceiling windows, the view of the lake that she had woken up to for 19 years, all of it photographed from angles designed to maximize the impression of space and light, captioned with the language of the listing. Sophisticated high-rise residence, lake views, full amenity building as though it were simply a commodity in an inventory, as though no particular person had lived there, had filled those rooms with the specific weight of a life. The asking price was listed at the bottom. It was a fair price. Julian had done his research. Carmen was still talking. Evelyn handed the phone back and said nothing, because there was nothing she could reliably say yet. She nodded. Carmen left. Evelyn sat on the edge of the thin mattress and looked at her reflection in the small plastic mirror mounted above the pressboard dresser. The mirror was cheap enough that the image in it had a slight distortion, a wavering quality at the edges, as though she were looking at herself through shallow water. She saw a woman of 72 in a hospital gown, her silver hair flattened on one side from sleeping, her left arm lying in her lap with the patient imprecision of something learning to cooperate again. She saw the hollowing at the cheeks that came from weeks of institutional food. She saw the particular expression of her own eyes, which had always been her most identifiable feature, pale gray, very still, the quality of attention in them unchanged. She had nothing. She had a hospital gown and a name she could not yet reliably speak out loud, in a drawer that stuck. She thought of the ledgers. The actual ones, the binders of records she had kept throughout her 41-year career, methodically updated, cross-referenced, stored in the fireproof cabinet in the study of the penthouse. She thought of Julian in that study, which she knew he had been in because Carmen had mentioned again, with the innocent helpfulness of someone reporting an interesting fact that she had seen the son carrying boxes out of the building on 2 separate occasions last week. She thought of the shredder she kept in the study, the one she had used for sensitive documents, the one that produced a cross-cut pattern that made reconstruction theoretically impossible. She let one tear fall. It moved down her cheek and dropped from her jaw and was gone. She watched it in the mirror, and then she wiped her face with the back of her right hand, and that was enough of that. Is this where the Vance legacy dies, she thought. The smell of bleach and old soup was heavy in the small room. The distorted mirror held her reflection. No, The thought arrived not as hope or determination. She had no patience for those words, which had always struck her as belonging to the vocabulary of people who had never actually had to save themselves, but as simple fact. The cold declarative fact of someone who had, in a moment of crisis 30 years ago, looked at the ruins of a set of books and understood that the only path forward was backward, to the beginning, to what was actually true before the falsification had been layered over it. She had hidden things, not for sentiment, not because she had known specifically that she would someday need them, but because she had spent 41 years watching what happened to people who relied on the goodwill of others to protect what they had built, and she had drawn a different conclusion. The USB key, the server rack behind the pantry wall, Franklin's instruction, which she had taken seriously precisely because he was a man who chose his words as carefully as she chose her numbers. The pantry is where we protect them. She had nothing now but a gown and a stuck drawer in the contents of her own mind. But her mind had always been the thing that mattered. She lay down on the thin mattress. She stared at the ceiling, at the water stain in the corner. She began methodically and without haste to inventory everything she remembered about the server rack, the USB key, the encrypted files, the smart home system she had installed in the penthouse 8 years ago. With the quiet foresight of someone who understood that records, properly kept, were the only form of protection that couldn't be charmed away, or shredded or deleted with someone else's limp finger on a phone screen. The room smelled of bleach and old soup and the accumulated weight of other people's diminishments. She took none of it personally. She had work to do. Friends, what a journey we've been on with Evelyn so far. A retired accountant who spent 41 years making sure the numbers always told the truth, only to find herself helpless in a nursing home bed, stripped of her home, her finances, and even her voice by the very children she raised. Julian deleted the evidence while she lay on the floor. Chloe was selling her bags before the hospital bed was cold, and every person who should have helped her believed the story Julian told. But here's what Julian forgot. Evelyn Vance built her career on one principle. Numbers leave fingerprints. People leave records. And before any of this happened, before the stroke, before the nursing home, before the shredder, Evelyn had already put something in place that her children never knew existed. Stay with us. Because the woman who balanced the books for Chicago's most powerful men, she balanced one more set of books. And this one was for herself. The memory came back to her on a Thursday night. She had been lying in the narrow bed in the thin dark of the nursing home room, listening to the building settle, the radiator ticking, the distant sound of a television from the room at the end of the corridor, the intermittent beeping of something in the hallway that no one ever seemed to come and address. And she had been doing what she had been doing for the past several nights, working backward. She worked backward through the smart home installation, through the network architect she had hired out of a recommendation from Marcus Miller, her old friend from the cybersecurity years, the one she had worked alongside briefly in the early 90s when her firm had been auditing a defense contractor and Marcus had been doing penetration testing for the same company. Marcus, who had retired to a quiet house in Oak Park and still sent her a Christmas card every year without fail, the card always containing a brief handwritten note that managed to convey genuine interest in how she was, without requiring a lengthy response. The server rack behind the pantry wall. She had told Marcus about the idea when he had come for dinner the year of the installation. He had looked at the wall and then at her and said, with the particular appreciation of a man who had spent 30 years thinking about digital security, "Evelyn, you are my favorite client and I have never even billed you." The server held 8 years of smart home logs, camera footage, door access records, network activity, every device that had connected to the penthouse's system, every login, every timestamp, every late-night intrusion. She thought of the IP address in the banking log, July 2:47 in the morning. She thought of the Ring camera Julian had tracked during the dinner. She thought of 8 years of records stored behind a pantry wall that Julian, who had been living in Lincoln Park for 15 years and had never shown any interest in the penthouse's infrastructure, would have had no reason to locate or understand. Then she thought about the pill organizer, the old one, the white plastic weekly organizer she had stopped using when her doctor switched her to a blister pack prescription system. The one that had sat on the top shelf of the medicine cabinet for 3 years, holding nothing except a small rectangular shape she had pressed into the Sunday compartment on the day she received the encrypted drive from Marcus, just in case you ever need to access the vault from outside the house. Don't lose it, don't label it, and don't put it anywhere obvious. She had put it in a pill organizer on a medicine cabinet shelf. Julian, she thought, would have looked at that organizer with the incurious efficiency of someone cataloging an elderly woman's bathroom cabinet and concluded old medication storage, no longer in use. Trash. She pressed her right hand flat against the mattress. He didn't take it. The knowledge arrived not as relief. Relief was a luxury she hadn't earned yet, but as information, as the first entry in a new column. The sadness that had been sitting in her chest since the nursing home room consolidated in that moment into something with a different temperature. Not warm, not the performance of strength she had seen in other women who had faced things like this. The public resolving, the declarative moment. Something colder and more specific, the sensation of a professional who had identified the location of the discrepancy and understood now exactly what she was going to do about it. Her love for Julian had been, for the last several weeks, serving a different purpose than love was supposed to serve. She understood this now in the direct and unsentimental way of someone who had always been better with figures than with feelings. It had been his leverage. The reluctance to believe, the desire to find an alternative explanation, the instinct to protect all of it had cost her time she did not have to waste. She breathed slowly. The radiator ticked. The distant television murmured something she couldn't make out. She thought of Franklin's voice. The pantry is where we protect them. She had heard it as domestic wisdom when he first said it. She heard it differently now, not as metaphor, but as instruction. Precise, specific, addressed to her with the accuracy of a man who had known exactly the kind of person she was, and exactly what she would one day need to be reminded of. She had protected them for as long as she had believed they warranted protecting. Now she was going to protect herself. The first sound she made with deliberate intention was a single word. She had been practicing it, privately, in the small hours of the morning when the corridor was quiet. And there was no one to observe, not practicing the way a person practiced a speech, with performance in mind, but the way she had once practiced the most demanding spreadsheets, the ones that required a level of precision that could not be improvised. She was relearning the path between thought and sound, finding the parts of it that worked reliably, understanding which words her mouth would produce cleanly and which still snagged. No was clean, short, consonant forward, the kind of word that required minimal cooperation from the left side of her face. She said it to the morning nurse on a Wednesday, 2.5 weeks into her time at Lakeview Gardens, when the nurse moved toward her with the morning medication tray. The nurse, an older woman named Phyllis, who wore her hair pinned back severely and who had the practiced distance of someone who had learned to maintain professional equanimity in difficult circumstances, stopped. She looked at Evelyn with the assessing attention of someone recalibrating. "You don't want your medication," Phyllis said. Evelyn shook her head. She looked at Phyllis steadily. She pointed to the phone mounted on the wall near the door, the facility phone, the shared line that residents could request access to during designated hours. Phyllis considered this. Evelyn watched the consideration happen and recognized the specific nature of it, not unkindness, not cruelty, but the institutional calculus of a person determining whether what was being asked of her was within the bounds of what her position permitted. She had seen this calculation performed throughout her career, by junior accountants and administrative assistants and mid-level managers, and she had learned the precise pressure required to tip it in the right direction. She looked at Phyllis without appeal, without pleading, with the simple directness of someone who expected to be taken at their word. Because they had always been worth taking at their word. Phyllis brought her the phone. Marcus Miller answered on the third ring. He had a careful voice, not cautious in the way of someone guarding a secret, but careful in the way of someone who had spent 30 years in cybersecurity and had learned that the most dangerous mistakes were made in the first 10 seconds of a conversation, before you fully understood what you were being told. Evelyn had approximately 4 minutes on the phone before Phyllis would expect to have it back. She had worked out what she needed to say in the same way she had always prepared for difficult conversations. Not by scripting herself, but by identifying the 3 most essential pieces of information and finding the shortest path to each of them. Her voice was raspy. Some words she had to attempt twice, but the structure was intact. The order was correct, and Marcus listened with the complete, undivided attention of someone who understood that what he was hearing was not confusion, but precision working under constraint. She told him she was at Lakeview Gardens, 3rd floor east, room 318. She told him the pill organizer on the medicine cabinet shelf in the penthouse, the Sunday compartment. She told him glass ledger. Open it. 3 pieces of information. She managed all 3. A silence on the line. Then Marcus said, in a voice very quiet and very controlled, "How long have you been there?" She said, "Weeks. Are you safe?" She thought about the word. Safe was a relative term in her current circumstances, but Marcus was asking about immediate physical danger rather than the broader condition of her situation. And to that specific question, she could answer, "Yes." "I'll handle it," Marcus said. "Don't tell anyone you called me." She said, "I know." She gave the phone back to Phyllis. Marcus had always been methodical. It was the quality she had most respected in him during their brief professional overlap in the 90s. The ability to approach a system with the same patience it had taken the system's creators to build it. Never forcing, never assuming. Following the logic of what was actually there rather than what he expected to find. He had built the smart home logging system in the penthouse with the same methodology. 8 years of continuous records automatically backed up to a remote server every 72 hours, encrypted with a key that only the two of them possessed. He accessed the system from Oak Park, from the orderly home office she had visited twice and recognized as the workspace of someone who had organized their professional life the way she had organized hers. Everything findable, nothing redundant, the logic of the system legible to anyone who understood its purpose. What he found in the logs required 2 days to fully catalog. There were 47 separate instances of unauthorized network access to the penthouse system over the preceding 14 months. There were 18 hours of audio captured by the smart home assistant during conversations Julian had conducted in the penthouse. While Evelyn was out, conversations with an individual Marcus was able to identify through the cross-referencing of phone records and publicly available court documents, as a buyer Julian had been working with for 7 months. A buyer whose name appeared in 2 separate Chicago Tribune articles about fraudulent real estate transactions involving elderly sellers. There was footage from the Ring camera hub, including footage from the morning of November 14, a Sunday morning in early winter, in which a man of 45 in a dark overcoat could be seen entering the penthouse with a key, moving through the kitchen, crouching beside a figure on the floor, and spending 4 minutes and 31 seconds on a phone before dialing 911. There was the server room behind the pantry wall. Julian had, in fact, located the pantry. He had not located the panel behind it. And there was the glass ledger itself, the encrypted archive Evelyn had been building for 11 years. Not out of suspicion, not as a weapon, but because she was a woman who kept records the way other women kept diaries. Because she had always understood that truth required maintenance, that it did not simply persist on its own, but needed to be preserved with the same care and intention as any other thing worth keeping. The glass ledger contained a complete record of every financial transaction involving her accounts for the past 11 years. Every bribe Julian had accepted during his years as a defense attorney, documented through the smart home audio logs and cross-referenced against his publicly filed case records. Every communication between Julian and Chloe regarding the management of their mother's assets, captured through the smart home network and time-stamped. The entire architecture of what had been done to her, laid out with the thoroughness of someone who had spent a career preparing for the audit she hoped she would never need to call. Marcus made 2 calls after reviewing the glass ledger's contents. The first was to a federal prosecutor he had worked with during a financial crimes case in 2019. The second was to an attorney he trusted, a woman who specialized in elder financial abuse and had, in Marcus's assessment, the particular kind of professional fury about this category of crime that produced the most tenacious courtroom performances. He made these calls on a Friday evening. In room 318 of Lakeview Gardens, Evelyn had spent the preceding 2 days in the same methodical preparation. She walked. She had been walking every morning since the day after she called Marcus, using the cane the facility had provided, moving the length of the corridor and back in the quiet hours before the morning shift. The linoleum registered each step with a flat, hollow sound, thump, thump, the cane, marking the rhythm of a woman reacquainting herself with her own capacity for forward motion. She did not perform this walking for the nursing staff, did not make it visible or remarkable, did not discuss it. She walked in the early morning quiet of the corridor, and she thought about the glass ledger in the server room and the footage from a Sunday morning in November. And she walked with the economy of purpose of someone who was not practicing walking. She was practicing arriving. The penthouse sale was scheduled to close on a Thursday at 2 in the afternoon. Julian had arranged the meeting with characteristic logistical precision. The closing attorney would arrive at 1:30 to review the final documents. The buyer at 2, the title transfer to be completed before 5. He had told Chloe to be there by 1, telling her there would be a disbursement of the proceeds into their accounts by end of business. Contingent on the signing? He had spent the preceding week moving the last of Evelyn's personal effects, the items not already sold or listed, into a storage unit in Wicker Park, for which he held the only key. He had poured himself a glass of the 1945 Bordeaux at 11 in the morning. Evelyn had purchased that bottle at a Sotheby's auction 14 years ago for an amount that had made even her accountant's composure briefly visible. She had kept it in the climate-controlled wine storage beside the pantry, behind a small placard that read simply, "Not for general use, EV." Julian poured it without hesitation into a crystal glass that had been a wedding gift to his parents and did not find this ironic. Chloe arrived at 12:50. Carrying a large tote bag, she began loading with items from the living room, small decorative objects, a pair of Lalique vases, a framed photograph that had been on the console table since Evelyn moved in. She worked with the efficient, slightly breathless quality of someone completing a task before a deadline, occasionally checking her phone with the focused interest of a person monitoring a resale listing. They moved through the penthouse in their separate rhythms, Julian at the dining table with his paperwork, Chloe cycling through the rooms, and the apartment had a quality about it that neither of them appeared to notice. But that would have been immediately apparent to anyone who had spent 19 years living in it. It had been emptied of the specific gravity that a person's long habitation gives to a space. The rooms were still beautiful, still filled with light from the lake-facing windows. But the particular density that Evelyn had carried into every room she occupied was gone. And in its absence, the penthouse felt, for the first time, like what it was about to officially become a commodity. At 1:15, the pantry wall opened. It moved on its interior track with a hydraulic precision that Evelyn had insisted upon when she had it installed. The sound a controlled mechanical hiss, a single smooth movement from closed to a 45-degree angle, revealing the narrow server room behind it with its rack of equipment and the drop ceiling housing the retractable screen. Julian turned. He turned in the particular way of someone who has heard a sound that their body understood before their mind did a sudden, complete stillness, followed by a slow rotation that contained within it the specific quality of a person recognizing, as they turn, that what they are about to see is something they cannot be prepared for. His hand tipped the crystal glass as he moved and it fell from the table and shattered on the marble floor, the 1945 Bordeaux, spreading in a dark pool across the black and white veining, but he did not look at it. He looked at the screen. It dropped from the ceiling housing on its motorized track. A 90-inch panel, and the image it displayed had the clear, uncompressed quality of high-definition security footage. The kitchen of the penthouse, shot from the angle of the camera hub near the door. Timestamp in the lower right corner, November 14th, 6:22 a.m. The footage showed Evelyn on the kitchen floor. It showed Julian crouching beside her. It showed with the clinical precision of a recording that had no stake in its own content exactly what had happened during the 4 minutes and 31 seconds before he dialed 911, the phone unlocked with her limp finger, the navigation to the email application, the deletion of the account alerts, each action clear and time-stamped and irrefutable. The penthouse was very quiet. Chloe had come to the entrance of the living room. She was holding one of the Lalique vases. She looked at the screen and then at Julian with an expression that moved through several faces. Rapidly confusion, recognition, a flash of something that might, in other circumstances, have been mistaken for conscience, before settling into a stillness that was more frightening in its way than any of the preceding faces. Julian said nothing for a moment. The footage continued to play. Outside the windows, the lake was a flat silver in the early afternoon light. "Turn it off," he said. His voice had changed. The calibrated courtroom projection was gone, stripped away in the manner of a surface coating when the actual material beneath it is exposed. What remained was something thinner and less composed. The voice of a man who had spent months constructing an architecture that he was now watching disassemble itself in real time. "Turn it off." Louder this time. "I can't," Evelyn said. She came out of the hallway near the entrance, walking with the cane, her pace steady and deliberate, the pace she had been practicing in the corridor of Lakeview Gardens at 5:30 in the morning. The pace of a woman who had learned, in the last several weeks, the precise measure of what she was capable of and was no longer interested in performing anything less. She looked at Julian directly. She had not seen him since the hospital. He looked, she thought, as though he had aged in the months since the dinner. The kind of aging that wasn't years, but pressure, the thinning around the jaw, the tightness near the eyes. "Mom," he took a step toward her. "Let me explain. Mana wuna from Nebruntuana." Julianne. Her voice was still slightly raspy. The word came out cleanly. "Don't." He stopped. The footage on the screen had advanced to the timestamp 6:26 a.m. the moment he dialed 911. But the screen did not stop there. The footage cut to a second recording, this one audio. A conversation in the penthouse living room, captured by the smart home system on a date 3 months prior. Julian's voice, unmistakable, clear, discussing the timeline of the penthouse sale, with a third party whose voice Marcus had identified through the federal prosecutor's database as a man with 2 prior fraud convictions involving elderly sellers. Chloe set the Lalique vase down on the side table very carefully. "There are 22 recordings," Evelyn said. She had counted them. "The prosecutor has all of them. So does my attorney." "But Julian began. "Don't." She looked at him with the same pale gray attention she had always brought to the things that mattered most. The things that required her to see exactly what was in front of her rather than what she wished were there. "I've been doing this for 41 years. You should have known that I keep records." The elevator doors at the end of the corridor chimed. Not the closing attorney. Not the buyer. 3 people stepped out, Marcus Miller, looking exactly as he always had, precise, unhurried, carrying a laptop bag over one shoulder with the ease of a man who had known he was coming here today for longer than anyone else in the room. Behind him, the federal prosecutor, a woman in her late 40s in a charcoal coat. And behind her, 2 FBI agents, the particular quality of their entrance filling the room with the specific gravity of institutional consequence. Chloe said very quietly, "Julian." Julian looked at the agents. He looked at the screen still playing. He looked at his mother. He made no motion to run. She had known he would not because he had run out of calculation, but because she understood, had always understood, that Julian's particular kind of wrongdoing was the kind that had always relied on the assumption that no one was watching closely enough. He had never had a contingency for being caught by someone who had spent 41 years watching exactly this kind of thing and had prepared accordingly. "Today," Evelyn said, and her voice was steadier than it had been in months, "the Federal Ledger wrote in ink what my heart had been shouting in silence." She had prepared that sentence. She had composed it in the narrow bed in room 318, in the thin dark, lying on the thin mattress, and she had known when she composed it that it was exactly right, not a performance, not a flourish, but the precise articulation of a fact. The handcuffs made a sound she would remember. Not dramatic, not satisfying in the way that entertainment had always suggested satisfaction would feel, just real, just specific, just the actual sound of metal on wrist, and then the particular silence that followed it. The penthouse sale was voided at 2:17 in the afternoon. The paperwork was seized. The title remained in Evelyn Vance's name. She stood at the window and looked at the lake while the agents did their work behind her. 40 stories below, the city moved in its indifferent rhythm, the same rhythm it had maintained through everything she had survived. She watched the water. She had not lost her children today. She had confirmed, with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, what she had been understanding slowly for the past several months. She had never quite had them, not in the way she had believed she did, not with the reciprocity that the word was supposed to imply. It was not grief exactly. It was the sensation of a long overdue reconciliation with a set of facts. The sirens were distant, then farther away, then gone. The penthouse was quiet in the days that followed in a way that was different from the silence it had held before. Evelyn had lived in spaces that held silence the way they held furniture as an ambient presence, filling the available volume. The silence of the penthouse in the weeks after Julian and Chloe were processed and charged was different. It was the silence of a space that had been restored to itself, that had been emptied of the static generated by years of things not said and things said falsely, and the particular invisible weight of a situation that has been approaching its conclusion for longer than any of the participants were willing to acknowledge. She noticed this in the way she noticed most things, not dramatically, not with the conscious recognition of a marked occasion, but with the quiet attention of someone registering a change in the quality of a room. She opened the windows. She had not opened them since before the stroke, and the November air had become December air, cold and lake-edged, carrying the particular smell of Chicago in winter, a cleanness that had always struck her as one of the city's underrated qualities. The way the lake scrubbed the air of the milder accumulations and left something sharper in its place. She stood at the open window and let the cold move through the penthouse. The legal proceedings were in Marcus's hands and her attorney's hands, the attorney Marcus had called, a woman named Patricia Holloway, who had reviewed the glass ledger's contents with the focused intensity of a person encountering evidence that confirmed everything she had spent her career arguing was happening to people like Evelyn and rarely documented well enough to prosecute cleanly. "This," Patricia had said, setting down the last page of the ledger, summary and looking at Evelyn across the conference table, "is the most organized case file I have ever received from a client." Evelyn had taken this as the compliment it was intended to be. Julian's disbarment proceedings had been initiated by the Illinois attorney. Registration and disciplinary commission within 72 hours of the FBI's involvement. Chloe had retained a separate attorney. There were conversations to be had, processes to be followed, months of institutional procedure ahead. Evelyn was a professional, and she understood this. Understood that justice as an actual experience rather than a concept. Moved at the speed of documentation and scheduling and the availability of courtrooms, not at the speed of narrative. She was not impatient. She had the records. The records were not going anywhere. The document her attorney had prepared sat on the writing desk for 2 days before Evelyn signed it. Not from hesitation, she had decided this long before the paperwork existed, but because she had always believed that significant decisions deserved to be approached with deliberateness, that the moment of signing should be commensurate with the weight of what was being signed. She wanted to come to it rested, clear on a morning when the light was good and she was not performing the decision for anyone. She came to it on a Friday morning, a clear, cold December day, the lake visible from her desk, as it always was, the light coming in at the low winter angle that made the water look like hammered silver. She sat down with her coffee. She read the document once more from beginning to end, because she had always read everything she signed from beginning to end, regardless of whether she had drafted it herself. The document donated the penthouse to the Vance Franklin Foundation for Elder Legal Protection, a foundation she and Patricia had begun establishing in the preceding weeks, named for her and for her late husband's particular brand of quiet preparation. The foundation's purpose was the provision of legal representation and financial advocacy services to elderly individuals facing exploitation of the kind Evelyn had faced. The kind that occurred in the gap between what institutions assumed and what was actually true in the space created by the dismissal of elderly women as unreliable narrators of their own circumstances. She thought about the social worker's office. She thought about the nursing home room with its plastic mirror and its smell of bleach. She thought about every person who had been in that room before her and after her without the 41 years of professional experience that had given her the tools to understand what was happening and the habits of mind that had led her, years before she needed them, to prepare. She signed the document. Her name came out as it always had, the E of Evelyn, with its small, precise forward lean, the V of Vance, angular and certain. She looked at it for a moment on the page. For the first time in a long time, it looked exactly like hers. In the early afternoon, she moved the writing desk chair to the balcony. She made a cup of tea, the loose-leaf Darjeeling she kept in the third drawer of the kitchen, the one she had always preferred and had never stopped preferring. She carried it out in the cup Franklin had brought back from a trip to Kyoto, blue-glazed, slightly irregular, the kind of object that announced its handmade origins in the slight asymmetry of its walls. She sat on the balcony in her winter coat and her scarf, and she looked at the lake. The lake was immense and still in the early afternoon light. The distant shore was a thin, pale line, barely distinguishable from the horizon. A container ship moved in the far water, too distant to be heard, its progress so slow that it seemed to be barely moving. The sky was clear and high, and winter blue, the particular blue that only came on the coldest clear days. The kind of blue that had no warmth in it and was beautiful precisely because of that. The penthouse was behind her. No hidden rooms. No server racks behind pantry walls. No encrypted drives and pill organizers. She had handed all of it to Patricia, who had handed it to the prosecutor. And the glass vault that had held the truth for 11 years had been opened and its contents delivered to the institutions whose job it was to act on them. She had nothing hidden anymore. This, she thought, was what Franklin had meant. Not that the pantry was where you kept weapons. The pantry was where you kept what mattered, tended carefully, until the moment when it could be brought out into the light and used for its actual purpose. She drank her tea. At 72 years old, she was beginning again. Not with the reluctance or the grief that the phrase usually implied, not beginning again, because everything had ended, but beginning again the way a person began a clean ledger, with a fresh page and no entries yet, the blank columns full of possibility rather than absence. She was not naive about what came next. There were court dates ahead and procedures, and the slow institutional processing of what had been done to her and by whom. There were relationships that were not salvageable. She had arrived, by the time the agents had left the penthouse, at a clear-eyed understanding of this, and she did not confuse clarity with the absence of pain. There were losses that were real and would remain real, but she was here. She was in her coat on her balcony with her tea and the lake in front of her, and her name on a document that meant something again. And the cold air was clean and sharp and fully real in a way that every breath of it confirmed. Starting over isn't failure, she thought. It's freedom. She had known this sentence before she needed it. Most of the sentences worth keeping, she had found, were like that. Known before their necessity, carried forward in the hope that you'd eventually arrive at the circumstance that made their meaning fully clear. She finished her tea. She set the cup on the balcony railing. She looked at the lake until the light began to shift, and the water turned from silver to a pale gold in the late afternoon sun. Then she went inside, washed the cup, placed it back in the cabinet, and began to think about what she would cook for dinner. For the first time in what felt like years, she was cooking only for herself, in her own kitchen, with her own hands in a room where the pantry held nothing. But groceries and the windows were open, and the cold air moved freely through the whole apartment. She stood at the counter, cool marble, black and white veined, and she felt under her fingertips exactly what it had always felt like. Solid. Hers. True. Friends, how did you find today's story? Evelyn Vance walked into this story as a woman of 72 who had spent her life making sure the numbers always told the truth. And then the people closest to her decided that her truth no longer mattered, that her voice could be erased. Her memory questioned. Her life's work taken from her while she lay in a hospital bed unable to speak. But here's what I keep coming back to. The thing that stays with me long after the story ends. Evelyn didn't save herself in the courtroom. She didn't save herself in the moment the FBI walked through the door. She saved herself years before any of this happened, in the quiet and unremarkable act of a woman who understood that records matter, that preparation is a form of love for yourself. Love for the truth, love for the version of your life that deserves to be protected. We live in a world that sometimes forgets what older men and women have built. That treats a lifetime of experience as though it becomes less valuable the longer it accumulates. Evelyn's story is a reminder that wisdom doesn't diminish with age, it compounds. And that the people who underestimate that fact have always, in the end, been wrong. If you have someone in your life who is older, who has given everything and trusted the people they gave it to hold them, check on them. Believe them when they tell you something is wrong. And if you are that person, if you have ever sat in a room where your own competence was being explained away, where the story being told about you bore no resemblance to who you actually are, I hope this story felt, in some small way, like the thing it was meant to feel like. Like justice, like dignity, like your name, signed in your own hand, feeling exactly like yours. I hope this story brought you something real today. If it did, please subscribe and hit that like button. It means more than you know.